On the morning of April 18, 1943, American codebreakers handed Admiral Chester Nimitz a piece of paper. On it was a flight schedule. A precise, detailed itinerary for one of the most important men in the entire Pacific War, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who had dragged America into the deadliest conflict in human history. And the Americans knew exactly where he was going to be, exactly when, exactly how. What happened next was one of the most daring, most secretive, and most consequential interception missions ever carried out in the history of aerial warfare. 16 pilots, 18 planes, over 400 miles of open ocean, and one shot to change the course of the war. This is that story. To understand why this mission mattered so much, you have to understand who Yamamoto was. This wasn't just a general. This wasn't just another flag officer sitting behind a desk somewhere in Tokyo. Yamamoto was the brain, the strategist, the man the Japanese Imperial Navy built its entire war doctrine around. He had studied at Harvard. He spoke English. He understood America in a way that most Japanese commanders simply didn't. And ironically, that understanding made him dangerous in a way that went beyond tactics or firepower. He knew that Japan couldn't win a prolonged war against the United States. He had said it himself before Pearl Harbor. He told the Japanese government that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, he had no confidence whatsoever. But here's the thing. He was still fighting, still commanding, still pushing. And in April of 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point. The Americans had won at Midway. They had ground through Guadalcanal at enormous cost. Japanese morale was fracturing at the edges, and Yamamoto knew it. So he planned something, a tour, an inspection of Japanese forward positions in the Solomon Islands, a show of strength, a morale mission. He was going to fly out to the front lines himself, to show his men that the Admiral was still there, still leading, still committed. It was the kind of gesture that great commanders sometimes make, and it was the kind of gesture that gets great commanders killed. On April 13, 1943, a Japanese naval signal was transmitted from Rabaul. It was encrypted with the Japanese naval cipher known as JN-25, and it contained something extraordinary. Yamamoto's complete flight itinerary, the exact date, the exact time, the exact route, the specific aircraft he would be flying in. How many escort fighters would accompany him? Every detail. American signals intelligence had been cracking JN-25 for months. And when that message came through, it landed on the desk of Commander Edwin Layton, intelligence officer for Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Layton read it again and then walked it straight to Nimitz. The opportunity was almost too perfect to believe. Nimitz understood immediately what he was looking at, but he also understood the weight of what he was being asked to consider. If the Americans moved on this intelligence, if they sent planes to intercept Yamamoto, the Japanese might realize their cipher had been broken. And JN-25 was giving the Americans enormous strategic advantages across the entire Pacific theater. It was killing one man worth potentially compromising one of the most valuable intelligence assets of the war. Nimitz sent the question up the chain. It went to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. Knox took it to President Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt's response was simple. Get Yamamoto. The order came back down. The mission was on. Now here's where the story gets complicated. Because this wasn't a simple task. Yamamoto's route would take him from Rabaul to Balhae, a small island airstrip near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. The distance from the nearest American airbase on Guadalcanal to the interception point was roughly 430 miles. 430 miles of open ocean. No landmarks. No navigation aids beyond dead reckoning and compass bearings. And they needed to arrive at the precise moment Yamamoto's plane came in for its approach. A few minutes early, the Japanese escort fighters would see them. A few minutes late, Yamamoto's plane would already be on the ground. protected by anti-aircraft guns, ground troops, and the entire garrison at Balhae. The timing had to be almost mathematically perfect. And there was another problem. Range. The aircraft available on Guadalcanal at that time were mostly Grumman F-4F Wildcats and various other naval fighters. None of them had the legs for a mission that long, not with enough fuel left over to actually fight. But there was one aircraft that could do it. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was something else entirely. Twin engines, twin tail booms. That unmistakable silhouette that pilots on both sides of the war immediately recognized. The Germans called it the fork-tailed devil. The Japanese called it two planes, one pilot. It was fast, it was heavily armed. 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all firing from the nose, which meant no convergence problems at range. And crucially, with drop tanks attached, it had the range to reach the interception point and still have enough fuel to fight its way home. Barely, but enough. The 339th Fighter Squadron on Guadalcanal was equipped with P-38s, and on the evening of April 17th, 18 of their pilots were called into a briefing room and told something that made most of them go quiet. They were going after Yamamoto. The pilots were told the bare minimum: that a very high-value target would be flying into Balhae on the morning of April 18th, that they needed to intercept and destroy the aircraft before it landed. That this mission was classified at the highest level and they were not to discuss it with anyone. Most of them figured out who the target was. None of them said it out loud. Major John Mitchell was given command of the mission. Mitchell was an experienced combat pilot, methodical and precise. Exactly the kind of officer you wanted running an operation this delicate. He worked out the navigation himself. No radio contact, no landmarks. They would fly low under Japanese radar, hugging the surface of the ocean. They would maintain strict radio silence the entire way. And they would arrive at the interception point at exactly 9:35 in the morning. Mitchell calculated the course. 4 legs. Compass headings worked out to the degree. Timing worked out to the minute. On the morning of April 18th, shortly after 7 in the morning, 18 P-38s lifted off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and turned northwest over the Solomon Sea. They flew low, very low. In some accounts, pilots described flying at treetop height over the water, their propellers kicking up spray, all to stay below Japanese radar. For the next hour and 45 minutes, there was nothing but ocean, engine noise, and the compass needle. No one broke radio silence. Yamamoto, meanwhile, was precisely on schedule. He had departed Rabaul at 6 a.m. in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the Japanese Navy's standard long-range medium bomber, nicknamed Betty by Allied forces. A capable aircraft but notoriously vulnerable to fire, with fuel tanks that weren't self-sealing. Pilots who flew them had a darker nickname for the plane: the Flying Lighter. Yamamoto was aboard one G4M. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, was in a second. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters flew escort, split into 2 groups of 3. By Japanese standards, this was a routine inspection flight. By the standards of what was waiting for them 200 miles away, it was a death sentence already written. At 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute early, Major Mitchell spotted something through his cockpit glass. 2 Betty bombers, 6 zeros, right on time, right on course. Yamamoto's schedule had been kept to the minute. Mitchell's hands were steady. He gave the signal. The attack flight, 4 P-38s designated as killers, peeled off and dove toward the bombers. Mitchell took the remaining aircraft up to altitude to engage the Zero escort. The kill flight was led by Captain Tom Lanphier, and his wingman was First Lieutenant Rex Barber. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been debated by aviation historians for decades. Both Lanphier and Barber claimed the kill. Both men provided accounts that contradicted each other in important ways. The official record at the time credited Lanphier. later analysis of the crash site, wreckage examination, and ballistic evidence has led many historians to conclude that Barber likely fired the decisive burst. But here is what is not disputed. At approximately 9:35 on the morning of April 18, 1943, one of the G4M bombers went down over the jungle of Bougainville. Trailing smoke and fire, it crashed into the dense forest north of Buin. The second bomber, carrying Ugaki, was also shot down. It crashed into the ocean. Ugaki survived. The one over the jungle did not go into the ocean. The one over the jungle carried Yamamoto. A Japanese search party found the wreckage the following morning. Yamamoto was found in his seat, still upright, still gripping his sword. He had been killed by two .50 caliber rounds. One to the jaw, one to the shoulder. He was almost certainly dead before the plane hit the trees. Japanese military leadership kept his death secret from the public for over a month. The shock within the Imperial Navy's command structure was immediate and severe. Japan's most brilliant naval commander, the man who had planned and executed Pearl Harbor, who had designed Japan's entire carrier-based strike doctrine, was gone. And the Americans couldn't tell anyone how they knew where he'd be. For years after the war, American veterans who had participated in the mission were careful about what they said. The intelligence secret behind Operation Vengeance, as the mission was officially named, was protected long after the fighting stopped. The question historians still debate is whether it mattered. Whether killing Yamamoto actually changed the outcome of the Pacific War. The strategic argument for yes is straightforward. Yamamoto was irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Minachi Koga, was competent but not visionary. Japanese naval strategy after Yamamoto's death became more reactive, more defensive. The bold carrier strike doctrine that had defined Japan's early war success became harder to execute without its chief architect. And there's a psychological dimension that's harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. Yamamoto had been a towering figure. His death sent a message through the Imperial Navy that could not be unsaid. The Americans could reach him, if they could find him out here, in his own territory, on a routine inspection flight surrounded by fighter escorts. Then where exactly was safe? Back on Guadalcanal, the pilots who returned from the mission landed, reported to the debrief, and were immediately told to say nothing. Some of them didn't know for certain whether they had succeeded until days later. Mitchell's navigation had been nearly perfect. Of the 18 P-38s that departed Henderson Field that morning, all but one made it back. Lieutenant Raymond Hine failed to return. His fate was never definitively established. He was listed as missing in action. One man out. Against a target of that magnitude, in an operation that required that level of precision, the mission planners would have called it a success by almost any measure. But Raymond Hine was still out there somewhere over the Solomon Sea, and no one ever found him. The pilots involved waited years, some of them decades, before they could speak openly about what they had done. When the intelligence methods behind the mission were finally declassified, the full picture emerged. What had looked like an almost impossibly lucky interception was actually the product of months of painstaking signals intelligence work. Hundreds of hours of codebreakers poring over encrypted Japanese transmissions. The entire JN-25 operation, which had been feeding American commanders critical intelligence since Midway. Yamamoto's death wasn't luck. It was precision. It was intelligence. It was planning. And it was 18 P-38s, flying 400 miles over open ocean without a single radio call. The margin between success and complete failure had been razor thin. A few minutes off course, a slight change in Yamamoto's schedule, one Japanese radar operator looking at the right screen at the right moment. Any one of those things, and history runs differently.